Good morning, everyone. Welcome back. Slightly smaller crowd this morning. I'm not sure if that's down to the 8 a.m. start or, a certain team winning again last night. Go Celtics. So to kick this morning off, it is my pleasure to introduce Priya Jayachandran. Priya spent more than 15 years in community development real estate banking, both in New York and in DC. Where she became recognized as an industry expert on affordable finance deal structuring. Priya then went on to serve in the Obama administration at the Department of Housing and Urban Development from 2014 to 2017, where she became the senior policy advisor and then the director of the front office of multifamily housing, and ultimately ended up as the deputy assistant secretary for multifamily housing programs. For the next 6 years, Priya then has led the National Housing Trust, which in itself is committed to the preservation of home, opportunity, and the dignity through affordable housing. We're truly honored to have her here this morning, and Priya, I welcome you on stage.
Good morning, and thank you so much for having me. It's nice to be on the campus and back with Ed Golding, who I had the pleasure of working with at HUD and FHA. In looking at the agenda, it seemed that a lot of the sessions were entitled The Future of This or The Future of That, and so that's the tone I want to take for the next 25 minutes of thinking about the future of affordable housing in the U.S. Right now. And going to try and strike a bit of an optimistic note. I think so much of affordable housing panels tend to be doom and gloom, and that's the world I live in, and so going to try and pivot from that. To a certain degree, for us housers, it's an exciting moment. We have, for the first time in at least my 30-something years doing this work, housing has finally percolated up to be an election issue. For so long, we never were able to overcome so many other education and foreign policy and other crime, domestic concerns, but at the local, state, and finally at the national level, you are seeing housing as an election year issue. From my vantage, neither candidate yet has come out with a meaningful housing platform, but hopeful that as we get closer to November, either voters or the media ask or the candidates put forward meaningful proposals. But either way, come January 2025, we'll have a new administration, and there will be pressure and an opportunity for hopefully major housing legislation. Because the reality is that we haven't had major housing legislation in nearly 40 years. 1986 was the last major housing package as part of the 1986 Tax Act. And what also bodes well for next year is that the 2017 Trump-era tax cuts expire. And so often called, I think, Tax-ageddon. Next year, we'll see a major tax package. And I think among housers, there's a hope that housing has an opportunity to glom on to one of those tax bills next year and see opportunities. I think the other exciting moment is that you see corporations stepping up. I have the opportunity of living in one of Amazon's 3 priority markets of Washington, D.C., because their HQ2 is based in Arlington. And I'm no apologist for Amazon, but they have stepped up in a meaningful way. It was originally a $2.1 billion commitment in the 3 markets of Puget Sound, the Washington metro area, and Nashville. And then just last week, they re-upped another $1.4 billion. What that's meant in our region is over the last 3 years, that money has helped create and preserve 9,400 homes. That's meaningful. And in their press release, I think that what they said is that in total, the combination of homes that they created in Nashville, Washington Metro, and Puget Sound was equivalent to the population of Kirkland, Washington. So whatever their motives, and I'm not gonna go there, but that corporate leadership has been meaningful. But what I will say about the motives, and we're seeing this now increasingly among hospitals, healthcare providers, part of that bubbling up as an electoral issue is that any employer is seeing housing as a workforce issue, the ability of their workers to live and work, afford to live close to where their employment is, the ability to arrive at work on time. If you're talking about Marriott hotels, which are based also in the Washington metro area, or major hospital systems, the ability to live and work close to your place of employment is becoming increasingly difficult. And so you're seeing employers increasingly pay attention to housing, not just as a philanthropic issue, but as a retention issue, as a workforce issue. And for those of us working in housing, I think that also is an exciting opportunity. So let's delve into a little bit more. What are those opportunities? And I would cite 4, and I'm going to focus mainly on the rental housing market, but I'll give a little talk a little bit at the end about home ownership, because most of affordable housing, when you're talking about people making under 80% AMI, often under 60% AMI, is largely concentrated in rental stock. It is worth noting that over 50% or almost 50% of rental housing is in single-family rental, but that has been relatively hard to track. That's starting to change, for better or for worse, because historically that had often been more individually owned. Now you're seeing portfolios and institutional investors starting to buy up single-family rentals. But most of the data that we have is around multifamily rental, and that's the arena that I largely work in. So I'd say the first area that has gotten a lot of attention over the last few years, and we still have work to do, is housing supply. As a country, we have not built enough housing over the last 30 years. You name any city in the country, for a variety of reasons, our housing stock has not kept pace with population growth. And in the affordable housing space, you not only have population growth, but you also have increasing income inequality. So that we have, as a country, minted over the last 30 years more people who need affordable housing at the same time that we have created a whole lot less housing. There are a number of reasons for that I'm sure others have talked about. One of them that gets a lot of attention in the press is zoning. The statistic I like to use is that the city of Los Angeles is home to 10 million people, but current zoning would allow for 4 million. As a country, we tend to like to get there first, then hold hands and enclose wherever we got first from anybody else coming in. We like to have an opportunity and say that we're open to having it, but we use sometimes nefarious means to prevent other people from coming in. And zoning has become a weapon of exclusion in this country. And so there's been a lot of attention over the last few years of loosening zoning. I think Minneapolis was one of the first a few years ago to up zones, eliminate single-family zoning, and allow for up to 3-plexes. I think the mayor's original proposal was for 4-plexes. It got compromised at 3-plexes. But I think that zoning gets a lot of attention. I think it has a role, but there's no panacea. There's no magic wand that's going to change our supply. And on affordable housing, zoning helps. It's certainly a factor. But sometimes I think that one of the reasons that zoning gets so much attention is that it's relatively cost-free. And I think the harder part to talk about is money and subsidy. And I think the challenge with affordable housing is it's fundamentally a game of arithmetic. Any development usually is. It costs a fixed amount to build it, and you have a revenue stream that usually or hopefully is greater than your expenses, and that's your profit. Affordable housing, by definition, is the revenue side is restricted. You're saying, what can people in this market afford regardless of what it costs to build? And over the last few years, we all experience inflation. Costs to build and operate have escalated, and the ability to pay has stayed flat or in some cases eroded. And so that difference between revenue and expenses is as low as it's ever been. And so hence the need for subsidy. And I think that that's a relationship that the U.S. still struggles with relative to housing. We're comfortable supporting and subsidizing education. We're even comfortable to a certain degree subsidizing Boeing Airlines and defense contractors. But somehow, when you say that housing needs subsidy, for a lot of people that strikes them as unfair, that they didn't need a subsidy or that their parents didn't need a subsidy. And I think a lot of the dynamics have changed. There's a lot of attention on the racial wealth gap in this country. And if you look at it, most of the research and data shows that white wealth is 6 times the wealth of black wealth in this country, and most of that, for many people, came from home equity. And so thinking about how do we give people the opportunity to have that stable housing, it really comes down to subsidy. And in affordable housing, in supply, the biggest subsidy program is the low-income housing tax credit. The low-income housing tax credit, enacted in 1986, has been almost single-handedly, and today is the largest driver of affordable housing production in this country. And it has been a successful program, nearly 40 years old, but it has been it's allocated per person, per state, and each state allocates it. It increases with population growth, but what it hasn't increased with is inflation and that increasing income inequality. So the low-income housing tax credit used to be sufficient when it was enacted in the 80s and into the 90s for creating enough affordable housing that this country needed. Well, part of how we're in this supply crisis of not having enough beyond that growing income inequality is that the tax credit hasn't kept pace with our need. There has been legislation introduced for the last nearly 10 years to expand the tax credit. It got closer than it ever did earlier this year. The House passed it. The Senate failed to take it up. I think there's real hope and optimism that with that tax package that undoubtedly will pass next year because of the Trump-era tax cuts expiring, that the low-income housing tax credit will finally have a pathway to be expanded. The other part of supply beyond zoning and the low-income housing tax credit is regulatory relief and fast-tracking. Affordable housing is not uncommon to see an affordable housing development take 5 to 10 years from inception to renters moving in. Why is that? Because there not only are there the usual hoops that you have to jump through, water permits, sewage lines, but there's a lot of NIMBY opposition. And all of those approvals that are needed, every one of those is an opportunity that invites neighborhood opposition. And so increasingly, we're seeing jurisdictions around the country think about fast tracks, a fast lane, so to speak, for affordable housing. And I think that that's an opportunity for supply. I'd say the second opportunity beyond supply, which is near and dear to my heart and to the organization I lead, National Housing Trust, is preservation. We have an existing stock of affordable housing that is incredibly fragile. Most of the heyday of affordable housing building and creation in this country was the post-war boom years of the 50s, 60s, 70s. Those properties are now 70, 60, 50, 40 years old and sharing their wear and tear, just like any home that we live in is. The difference between maybe a homeowner that owns one of those houses and affordable housing community is back to that basic arithmetic. There's very little cash flow there to support reinvestment. Maybe you have the cash flow to operate the property. You get through and you can pay your property management, you can maybe pay your security costs, maybe you can pay your insurance, although insurance in multifamily has gone up over 27% over the last year. But what you don't have is what happens when you have the roof needs to be replaced, or you need to replace all of the kitchens and baths for normal wear and tear. Those sorts of big ticket items are what have been sacrificed because of those low margin, thin margins. And that was always the case, but I think what's happened over the last few years is those margins have gotten thinner. We have the impacts of climate change, where you're seeing more severe weather events. You had the pandemic, where people spent more time in their homes, which means more wear and tear. And you have inflation and escalating costs for every construction material. And that has meant that a lot of affordable housing owners like us are watching as our communities, the conditions deteriorate. And mission-based organizations like mine pride ourselves by mission on being offering beyond decent, safe, and sanitary housing. I call it dignified housing. And yet, if we look ourselves in the mirror, the reality in many cases is that we're effectively slumlords. The conditions are deteriorating. We see it, and we are powerless to do anything about it. Because the reality is that in this country, when we talk about any program, and I'll housing in particular is that we have a capital bias. We like to fund projects, we like to fund ribbon cuttings. What's a whole lot less sexy, and particularly now with elected officials, is funding operations and annuity obligations. You just look at the Social Security debate every year, the Medicare debate. Elected officials today are reluctant to sign on to any new annuity obligation. But the reality with affordable housing is that it's one thing to build, and you've got the low-income housing tax credit is a terrific program to build housing. But we need programs and support to operate that program, that housing, because the reality is that we have no support to operate, maintain, and repair. And I think that what we're seeing with that 1950s, 60s, 70s era housing now is that's really coming back to bite us, is that you're seeing that housing under the pressure of severe rains and temperatures, conditions that heat that wasn't built for, really starting to crack, literally and figuratively. And so that preservation opportunity is real. The last thing I'll add there is that my organization is launching what we're calling a preservation campaign to focus on this. And one of the things that we want to do is to help quantify that. Because that data, it has been hard to come by, of how much of that housing is vulnerable. Because to a certain degree, you have to make assumptions in that. What is decent, safe, and sanitary? What condition am I trying to bring it up to? You may think that a linoleum floor is decent, safe, and sanitary. Somebody else may think that it needs to be a tile floor. You have to come up with a standard and decide what that standard is, and then put a dollar value on it. But that's work that we are starting to do. The third opportunity I would say is on the services front. Research over many years has shown repeatedly that housing is sufficient but not necessary. It is a necessary but not sufficient intervention to alleviate poverty. Somebody is not going to get out of poverty without a stable home, but a stable home is not enough. And what mission-based organizations like mine have prided ourselves on are offering services, and in often cases, service navigation. You can't be all things to all people. We know housing, but what we often are able to do is coordinate with other organizations in our communities, food banks, job training, literacy programs, transportation programs, helping our residents after school programs for childcare and tutoring. What's been increasingly difficult is how you pay for those services. Back to that basic math and arithmetic, those margins are very thin. And historically, organizations like mine would fundraise for services. But it's little dribs and drabs. Without exaggeration, we'll get a $5,000 grant here and a $10,000 grant there. And it is increasingly hard in this labor market to commit to staff and be able to offer those services long term. The even harder part of services is offering services that are often required now by jurisdictions for what's called permanent supportive housing. We have a mental health crisis in this country, and increasingly, and we have in many cities, a drug crisis. And as affordable housing owners, we're seeing increasing numbers of ill and addicted residents in our communities. And in fact, in many places, in order to access subsidy from the jurisdictions that we're building and operating our housing, we're required to offer housing to a certain number of what are called PSH residents, permanent supportive housing residents, people with a mental illness or an addiction. But what we're finding is that we are ill-equipped to work with these populations. Our staffs are largely housing people and maybe some of that service coordination. But what is the needs of a lot of our communities have outstripped our capabilities. Increasingly, what we need are licensed social workers. And most cities don't have enough licensed social workers. And we certainly don't have the resources to pay for licensed social workers. And what we're finding is that many jurisdictions want to integrate PSH units in non-PSH housing. And it's creating strain. It's creating strain on our staffs, but it's creating tension with some of the other residents. If we're being honest, there have been violence issues. People feel scared or threatened sometimes with the level of mental illness of their neighbors or their community members. And I think that we're seeing this all across our urban centers. And homelessness is a visceral issue. We all see it. No one likes to see tent encampments. So voters and public officials want affordable housing owners to take in all of these residents, and it makes sense. But the cost to operate permanent supportive housing is way beyond what it costs to operate housing. And I think that in this country, we're really going to have to grapple with the mental health crisis and the addiction crisis and the nexus between those challenges and operating affordable housing. The final opportunity I'll talk about is innovation, and I think I missed yesterday. You had a lot of interesting panelists talk about innovation. Affordable housing, and I'd say affordable housing owners, candidly, have been late to the innovation game. And I think that that's something that it was a real miss on our side. I think that as a field, we have been in a defensive posture for so long that we spend most of our time and resources defending the low-income housing tax credit and the subsidy, and we tend to have a viewpoint that if we criticize a program or offer a new way to do something, then that would allow others to criticize that program and, God forbid, cut off our funding. And so instead, we perpetuate these programs that in many years, if you look at Section 8, Section 8 was repealed in 1983 and enacted, I believe, in 1974. The low-income housing tax credit was enacted in 1986. And we, as affordable housers, tend to glom on to these old systems and defend them to our graves, versus sometimes being willing to say that programs need to be involved and sometimes need to be replaced. And I think that we've been slow to do that, but it's starting to change. And I'd say we, on the public policy front, we're still a little behind, and I think that I am hopeful that with a new administration and new tax package that there will be more pressure for us to think about new programs. But where we have seen more innovation on the affordable housing side over the last few years is on the construction side and on the software side. So I think that I heard yesterday there was a discussion about modular housing. Modular housing is finally coming to affordable housing. I think there was a New York Times Magazine story last week that talked about that every industry in the US has become more productive since 1968, except the construction industry, where productivity has declined by half. It was really staggering to think about that in the context of how far we have advanced in technology. So we've now had several factory-built construction companies that are serving the affordable housing market, some in Europe, some in the US, and you're finding more affordable housing owners experimenting and trying it. I think the construction technology is accelerating faster than the regulatory parallel path that needs to enable factory-built housing, because our permitting system and our regulatory system still are designed for a sequential construction system where you complete 10% construction and you send out the inspector to inspect 10% construction. Then you complete another 20% and the inspector comes out. And the system hasn't evolved for when you build 80% at once. And so for what we hear from our peers that are using factory build or off-site construction is that it helps a little bit and want to be early adopters, but the reality is both the time and the cost have not caught up to the potential because of the regulatory side. And you have to often go through a parallel permitting system and then all of the sign-offs. But I think it is encouraging. We're starting to see some momentum. I think the other innovation that you're seeing is around ADUs, accessory dwelling units. It's been more prevalent on the West Coast, but accessory dwelling units are effectively a small unit that you can put in your backyard or even a basement that you could convert and make a rentable unit. The idea being that our supply crisis, we need all kinds of housing, and that if we were to create tiny homes in our backyards, that could be rental housing for somebody or potentially homeownership housing for somebody. I think there's a real opportunity, and I think that we want to exploit this potential as much as possible. I also think that often in the media, ADUs are seen as that silver bullet, and I think that there is no silver bullet. There is no one measure that is going to solve this. But I also think that when we think ADUs are great for a single person, and the last census showed us we have a lot more single people than we used to. But the reality is that it doesn't work well for a family. It doesn't usually work well for children. And so I think that it is one potential solution for the supply crisis, but we need a whole lot more. And I think it's often like zoning reform, popular because for city officials, it's relatively low cost. And I think everyone wants that free answer, and it doesn't exist, but I think people still look for it. The other place that we've seen innovation is on the software side. And in the affordable housing field, a company that gets a lot of attention these days is Isuzu. Isuzu offers credit scoring for renters. Until recently, if you paid your rent every month on time and you were a renter for the last 30 years, that did nothing to enhance your credit score. And if you didn't have a credit card and you didn't have a digital credit record, then despite being an on-time renter for many years, you might not, when you go to finally buy that house, you may be disadvantaged because you didn't have a good credit score. And so what Isuzu and other companies are doing are offering affordable housing owners like us a software system to be able to connect our residents on-time rent payments with the 3 credit reporting agencies to develop a credit profile and a credit score. Other software innovations are the inspections for affordable housing, the wait lists for affordable housing, the income certifications. Believe it or not, if you're an applicant for affordable housing and if you live in the region that I do, the DMV, where we have Washington, D.C., Maryland, and Virginia adjacent to one another, there is no single portal for applying for affordable housing. In fact, there is no portal. There is no system. You want to apply and be on the wait list for an affordable housing community, you have to go in person physically and put your name on a physical wait list, property by property. And if you live in the DMV, that process is different by regulation between the 3 different states of DC, Maryland, and Virginia. And because you're an affordable housing applicant, the likelihood is that you're working a 9-to-5 job, often probably hourly paid. So you would have to, and those offices are open 9 to 5. So you would have to take time off of work to go and physically apply to each of those communities. It's really bass-ackwards. And software finally is coming and trying to do something about that. There have been the Turner Center at UC Berkeley has been a shining light in the innovation for our field, and they have also created effectively an accelerator for new housing and affordable housing innovation. That's how Isuzu got launched, and we are seeing they're launching a builder's lab, and you're seeing a lot of tech money, CZI, the Chan Zuckerberg Foundation, the founders of Meta, and Ballmer, the former CEO, Ballmer Foundation, the former CEO of Microsoft, and others putting money into housing innovation, and it's finally accelerating and it's exciting. I am encouraged, but I also would say, and this is on the likes of my organization and my peers, that there's more innovation needed on the program design front. As a country, and when you look at education, we now have private schools, we have charter schools, we have traditional public schools. Within charter schools, you have virtual schools, you have tech-focused schools, you have community service schools, and you've seen, to a certain degree, a lot of innovation on the education front. And we haven't seen as much innovation on housing programs, really meeting people where they are. The low-income housing tax credit is an amazing program, but I would argue it was always meant to be one arrow in a quiver, and instead, for a variety of reasons, it has become our answer to every affordable housing problem. I'm reminded of the cliche, if you have a hammer, everything starts looking like a nail. And the low-income housing tax credit is one program, but the reality is we need lots of different housing programs. We need them for people who are below 30%. We need programs for permanent supportive housing. We need programs for people, what are called that missing middle, up to 80% or 120% of area median income. We need to think about the single-family home ownership market because that's getting bought up by institutional investors. So I think that there is a real opportunity over the next few years. We finally have the political winds at our back to do something about this problem. We've got partners in the tech sector, in the academic sector. Venture capital is finally interested in fintech for housing. And more than anything, we have a huge need in this country for affordable housing. And I think the consequences of not doing anything about it are ones that are beyond what most of us want to think about or imagine. And so I'm excited and hopeful for this opportunity over the next couple of years to rethink the future of affordable housing. Thank you.